I thought we should follow up with probably one of the biggest claims against the JP poll or the AP poll or the College Football Playoff Committee rankings, and that is SEC bias. SEC bias is alive and well. And if you don't believe me, go follow Daniel Jeremetrius Cannell on Twitter. I mean, this morning he is loitering outside of FSU Stadium. Don't know why, don't know what he's doing there. As far as I know, he hasn't moved back to Tallahassee, but he's out there in the shadow of his former stadium just rambling incoherently about SEC bias and blue blood bias. And I'm like, wow, how many biases can one have? But really, what are we talking about here? Because I want answers. If Daniel Cannell is right and he's identified a problem, I want to fix the problem. I just need to know, as many of you complained about SEC bias, I need to know from you, is it real? And is it a real problem, or is it just something you don't like? A bunch of SEC teams are ranked really highly. Is that flawed, or is it just something that you're not happy with? Because these are two very different diagnoses, and therefore I would prescribe very different medication for one versus the other. So, to start with, if you're telling me about SEC bias, I need to know what you're talking about. If you're talking about our show, for example, we get accused of this all the time. There's too much SEC bias on the show. There's too much SEC on the show. I would ask you, well, if you're doing a national college football show and you're trying to serve the viewership, and the viewership is disproportionately telling you both by where they live, but also by what they click on, that they're most interested in SEC content featuring the high caliber programs, how would you stack your show any differently? I mean, would you really have led with Oregon versus Illinois the other day? Because a lot of you had a problem with how we stacked the show. And you know what? That's all a matter of opinion. But I go back and forth with you guys sometimes. I always respect your opinion. I don't need you to like everything here. In fact, I welcome it when you disagree with me. But I've gone back and forth with several of you when you've claimed that the show was too SEC heavy. And I've said, well, how would you have stacked it differently? And usually, those arguments end in most of you seeing my way of thinking, because if there was another way of thinking that made more sense, I would go with that way of thinking. So that's part one of SEC bias. But part two of SEC bias gets out of the area of subjectivity, and it gets into the lanes that really matter, like how the teams are ranked and how the playoff committee stacks the teams. So if you are upset and you think there's too much SEC bias in the process of the rankings right now, especially the college football playoff rankings, I'd ask you this. What properly calibrated ranking system would not have a ton of SEC teams in the top 20 right now? Just pick any ranking system you want. If it's properly and fairly calibrated, how would you not have a ton of SEC teams in the top 20? Remember, there's a big difference, and it shouldn't be this way versus I don't like that it's this way. Because there are a lot of things I don't like that are technically right. I don't like driving 25 in a school zone, but there's a reason I need to drive 25 in a school zone. And similarly, I'm asking you, what properly calibrated and properly presented method for ranking teams would not have a ton of SEC teams in the top 20 right now? And I looked at a number of them today. You already know what the playoff committee rankings say. I looked at my power ratings. I've got 8 SEC teams in the top 17. So then you may say, well, everyone knows you're biased against the for the SEC, Josh. I would argue otherwise. I mean, my name literally was Pac-12 Pate until they killed my conference. But if you don't want to take my word for it, is Bill Connolly good enough for you? Is the S&P Plus good enough for you? I don't exactly think he has SEC tramp stamped on his lower back. He's got 9 SEC teams in his top 17 today. So I ask again, is it all SEC bias, or is it just a much deeper conference? Maybe not so many elite teams this year, but is it a deeper conference than all the other leagues? My answer would be yes, obviously. Maybe your opinion differs. I keep hearing a lot of this stuff that's said in the abstract. I was listening to Cannell. He and I go back and forth about this via text message just as much as we do publicly. Well, you can't let 5 SEC teams in the playoff. Why? Why? All of these statements are absent any context. How do you even know what the picture is going to look like? It could be that there's a bunch of chaos and there aren't enough SEC teams to even qualify for consideration. It could be that all of the chalk holds And there are 5 or 6 deserving teams sitting there at the end of the day. We don't know is the point. But if the situation plays out favorably for the SEC, what do you mean you can't let 5 of them in? What if there aren't 6 more deserving teams or 7 more deserving teams or whatever the math is? Of course you can let 5 of them in. You could put 3 of them in if the rest of the conference doesn't deserve it. And then I'll have someone, I guarantee you tonight this will happen, someone will shoot back at me if I talk about Ole Miss, for example. Well, they lost to Kentucky. They sure did. And then I just sit there and I twiddle my thumbs and I wait and I wait and I wait, and there's no follow-up. It's just they lost to Kentucky, period. So that's a data point. That's one data point. Of course, they just beat Georgia last week. And of course, when you look at their overall resume, they will have beaten a few quality teams, and their losses will have been on the road to LSU in a game they didn't trail for a single second. They also went and handled South Carolina. Like, these things won't matter. They lost to Kentucky. Again, this is backwards logic that is disproportionately applied to teams in conferences that you don't happen to like. I always notice this. If you applied the same standard across the board, you'd eliminate far more non-SEC teams than you would SEC teams. But people don't do that. And then I get you need to hold these teams accountable for losing. Well, you need to apply proper standards. Well, I don't really think you want that. A lot of you who are claiming that, I don't think you want that. Because what it sounds like you're asking for is blind resumes, right? And it sounds fair, doesn't it? Oh, yeah, forget about the SEC bias. Remove the Georgia logo and the Texas A&M logo. Let's just judge these teams based off their merit. Guys, I am telling you, if you're anti-SEC, that's the last thing you want. Because believe me or not, your better weapon against keeping a bunch of SEC teams out of the playoff is the SEC sticker. Because if you go blind resume, I promise you, if you properly calibrate the criteria and everyone is judged equally, quality wins, strength of schedule, you're going to have half a dozen SEC teams make that thing. You forget about the 2-loss teams. If you went blind resume and you did not know whose resume you were looking at, you'd end up arguing for a team like South Carolina if you judged all of it properly at the end of the year. And then I'd hit a button and you'd see the logo and you go, oh, never mind. What do you mean, never mind? Well, it's an SEC team, but that's not supposed to matter. Remember, we agreed to go blind resume, which is what this is supposed to be, by the way. After Conference Championship Saturday happens, and then you fill the auto bid buckets, should we not go etch-a-sketch left to right and erase the conference affiliation and just seed the thing based off resume? Is that not how that's supposed to work? I think a lot of you advocate for that until you find out the consequences of your advocation. Your advocation could end up with even more SEC teams in this thing. Now, I'm going to suggest a theory here. I can't prove it because we haven't seen it happen yet. I happen to believe that if we get to the finish line and there are 5 or 6 SEC resumes that are pretty darn competitive, I happen to think one of the only things that's going to keep 5 or 6 of them out is the fact that they are SEC teams. You may listen to that and say, no, Josh, SEC bias rules dictate that more SEC teams would make it in. Well, that's not the way I think that room's going to handle that. The way that room's going to handle it is they're not AI robots. They are humans. And so if it comes down to it, and you've got a Texas A&M resume versus a resume that of Notre Dame or, that of a second ACC team or something like that, it's not going to sound like a blind resume. What it's going to sound like is, do we put Notre Dame in here or do we put a 5th SEC team in? That's what it would sound like. You notice it's not merit versus merit at that point. It's not resume versus resume. It's 5th SEC team versus Notre Dame at that point. And I'm telling you, I think Notre Dame would get the nod because I think someone in the back of their mind would say, guys, are we really going to put a 5th SEC team in here over Notre Dame? Are we really going to do that? I mean, they've already got enough. Let's give someone else a shot. Do you think that's more likely? Or do you think it's more likely that athletic directors, because that's who the committee is made up of, from all over the country, are going to all of a sudden decide, no, we want to load it up with SEC teams? What do you think is more likely? For all the SEC bias conspiracy theorists out there, what do you think is more likely? It's my theory. We'll see how it works out.